Today we hear the story of Bartimaeus. It's a significant story for several reasons. It concludes the travel narrative that we've been reading from for the last month, where Jesus and his disciples are moving from ministry in Galilee to Jerusalem, where his passion will be set in motion. It's also the last healing story in Mark's gospel. And it's a story that crystallizes what Jesus has been trying to teach about faith. As I mentioned, Jesus and the disciples are traveling to Jerusalem. The first two sentences from our passage for today gives a sense of their movement through this particular story. They came to Jericho as he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho. Did you catch that? I mean, no sooner do they arrive in Jericho than they are leaving Jericho. It's like when we do one of those big family road trips to Colorado, and we have to drive through all of those little towns from the Amarillo area to the New Mexico border, through Childress and Channing and Dalhart and Texline. There's no intention to stop in any of these towns. They're actually annoyances that cause me to disengage my cruise control and slow to what feels like a crawl. The goal is to get through these towns and on our way as soon as possible. This is how it is for Jesus and the crowd traveling with him as he hits Jericho. He has no plans to slow down here. It's just one of the small towns he has to go through to get to Jerusalem. But Bartimaeus has other plans for Jesus. Like the small town cop on the side of the road, he is waiting for Jesus to pass through. Bartimaeus senses that this is his opportunity to come to Jesus' attention, and he's thinking, I am not throwing away my shot. Bartimaeus positions himself on the side of the road on the way out of town, just before Jesus and his entourage see that departing population sign and begin to pick up speed. As soon as he senses the group moving through, Bartimaeus begins crying out loudly, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. The folks around him try to shut him up. Cut it out, they say. You're embarrassing us. He'll tell everyone what a hick town we are. But Bartimaeus will not be silenced. He is emboldened all the more to shout even louder, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. The verb tense in Greek here indicates that Bartimaeus' speaking is this continuing, ongoing action. So it would sound something like, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. That loud, persistent cry would have been pretty hard to ignore. And even though the crowd tries to shut him up, Jesus hears him and stops mid-stride and says, call him here. These same folks who were shushing Bartimaeus, trying to hide him from Jesus, now do a 180-degree turn, and they say, take heart, get up, he is calling you. And so Bartimaeus, as he hops up, he kind of, from his perch, he throws off his cloak, and he comes out to Jesus. And Jesus asked Bartimaeus the same question that he has asked so many folks during this section of the Gospel of Mark. What do you want me to do for you? And Bartimaeus is ready with his response and says, Teacher, let me see again. Without spit and mud, without a touch, Jesus responds saying, go, your faith has made you well. And immediately Bartimaeus is able to see, and he begins following Jesus on his way. Jesus says that it is Bartimaeus' faith that has made him well. So based on the story, what do we know of Bartimaeus' faith that Jesus found so pleasing? First, Bartimaeus gets who Jesus is. No one else in Mark has been able to perceive so much about Jesus from so little data. The title that Bartimaeus uses, Son of David, appears only here in the whole Gospel of Mark. For Bartimaeus, the title indicates that Jesus is God's designated agent and introduces the idea of Jesus as a royal figure, an image that will take on much more significance as Jesus enters Jerusalem, goes on trial, and dies as a king. Bartimaeus, despite his physical blindness, has a spiritual sight into who Jesus is, a sight that is sorely lacking in the disciples, as we saw most recently in our James and John story from last week. And in addition to seeing who Jesus is, Bartimaeus also sees what Jesus can do, that Jesus can be a source of mercy and healing. No one in Mark's gospel has shown better sight into who Jesus is. Second, Bartimaeus persists. The folks in the crowd try to silence Bartimaeus. His need, his vulnerability is embarrassing to them. They've chosen to put themselves between Bartimaeus and Jesus, in essence deciding that it is they who should determine who is and is not worthy of Jesus' attention. Bartimaeus knows better and will have none of it. He will not be silenced. He will not allow himself to be shamed. He will bring himself into the presence of Jesus, and he, the man who cannot see, will be seen. Third, Bartimaeus expects transformation. Bartimaeus knows who Jesus is, and he knows that Jesus can make a profound difference in his life. Did you notice that detail about Bartimaeus tossing off his cloak as he made his way to Jesus? For a blind beggar, having a cloak against the elements in which you could collect and hide the money folks toss your way was like having shelter. It was Bartimaeus' home. The fact that he leaves the cloak behind when he comes to Jesus is a sign that he expects a change in his status. He is faithful that Jesus can restore him physically and socially. He comes to receive Jesus' mercy, not to return to his prior life, but to follow Jesus into a new life. Finally, Bartimaeus asks for the right thing. We've talked a lot about how prayer is about creating a space where our wills might be aligned with God's will for us, versus it being a place to drop off our laundry list of wants and needs. God's desire is that we be healed and that we have the ability to perceive. So when Bartimaeus asks to see again, Jesus restores that sight in all of its layered meanings. Contrast this to last week's gospel passage, where Jesus asked the very same question of James and John, only to have them request positions of power and prestige. When it comes to understanding what Jesus came to do, the disciples are more blind than Bartimaeus. We've looked at how Bartimaeus embodies faith, but I wouldn't want us to leave this story without looking at the crowd. The crowd, which includes the disciples, doesn't have the spiritual sight that Bartimaeus does. But look how Jesus uses the crowd. When he heard Bartimaeus call out, Jesus could have walked over to where he was sitting. In fact, given that Bartimaeus is a blind man, that might have been seen as the kinder move. But Jesus doesn't do that. He uses the crowd. The same folks who were shutting Bartimaeus down are now agents of his encounter with Jesus. They have a role. They have become witnesses to and vessels of Jesus' mercy. I want us to think for a moment about how the crowd is the church, how the crowd is you and me. How do we subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, keep people from the presence and notice of Jesus, either because we have preconceived ideas about who is worthy of interaction with Jesus, or because we are uncomfortable with their need or their circumstance. How might Jesus be drafting us to be agents of his care and his presence to these folks? How might Jesus be using his mercy to redeem us, helping us to put on his heart and mind? With his eyes wide open, Bartimaeus will follow Jesus into Jerusalem through the cross and into resurrection. May we also, with eyes wide open, be disciples who see Christ for who he is instead of who we may want him to be. The promise of this kind of faith, of Bartimaeus' kind of faith, is that we shall hear that message. Take heart, get up, he's calling you. Amen.